series. So this is a new initiative from the Lifelong Fellowship team at the Trust, where each month Rhodes Scholar is invited to come and talk about their literary works to those directly in the community and beyond. And it's great to see you here. So for the first session, I'm excited to welcome Ken Kamoche to talk about his fiction novel, Black Ghosts, a novel about the lives of Africans in China from the late 1980s, set against a backdrop of controversial Africa-China relations. And fellow scholar Ruth Nyakerario is here to moderate the conversation. She completed her master's in refugee and forced migration studies back in 2020 and is currently based in Nairobi at the British Institute in Eastern Africa. So I'll post the link to purchase Ken's book in the chat, but for now I'll hand over to Ruth, who will give you a further introduction to the session and to Ken, and we can get right into it. Please post any questions you might have in the chat as we go, and we can fit them into the Q&A session. But over to you, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Georgie. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. It's evening my end. And to start us off, I'd like to introduce Ken Kamoche, who will be having a conversation with today about his most recent novel, The Black Ghost. So Ken was born and raised in Kenya. He studied accounting and finance at the University of Nairobi. And then after interning in Poland, he became more keen to research general management and moved to the UK, where he studied management at Templeton College, but his college was St. Catherine's in 1988, and completed an MPhil and a DPhil. And after Oxford, he began his academic career at the University of Birmingham in 1992. In 1997, he moved to the City University of Hong Kong. And he's a prolific writer and says that he honed his writing skills while in Hong Kong. Really keen to hear about that today. And he's published several short stories in magazines such as Ambit, World Literature Today, New York Stories, or Safiri, and in several edited works. Some of the short stories later appeared in A Fragile Hope, a collection worth reading, and which made it to the Commonwealth Best First Book Award shortlist. And one of his stories won second prize in the Olada Ikwano Prize for African Writing. And this congruence of short stories inspired the novel that we'll be chatting and talking about today, Black Ghosts. He currently is a management academic based at University of Nottingham, occasional newspaper columnist, and a writer of fiction. Just to give us a quick short introduction and my own impressions of the book, I highly recommend it to everyone who's not read it, especially lovers of history, travel, and those keen on matters Afro-China relations. Reading this book, I learned immensely about how different communist China was in the 80s and the alienation that foreigners faced then that he nicely captures in his book. I must say that Ken's research is meticulous. I deeply follow and explore works which look at anti-Black racism and look at discrimination and Blackness. But I must mention that prior to reading this book, I had not interacted so much with works that look at Black diaspora in Asia, particularly China. I like how one reviewer describing his book said, it's the kind of book that you return to every now and then, and each time you find a new gem. Well, I'm just going to hand over right now to Ken, who's going to share with us an excerpt of his book, and then we're going to have a round of questions. And I'd like to encourage us all to share questions in the chat, and also we'll have a question and answer session after this, where we're going to respond to some of the questions that you raise. Thank you. Over to you, Ken.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Georgie, for organizing these sessions. It's lovely to be here. And thank you to everybody who's joined us. I look forward to having an excellent and stimulating conversation with you all. So Black Ghosts, this is a book. As Ruth said, it's about the Black diaspora in Asia. It was inspired by the times that I spent in Hong Kong in the late 90s into the early 2000s. But I will be saying a little bit more about all of that later on. So I thought it would be helpful just to give you a flavor of the book by just reading a couple of pages, just to give you a sense of what the story is about. So the book really is essentially a love story. It's an African guy from Zimbabwe who goes to China after earning a scholarship, and it's a love in a difficult time. But there are also lots of other issues that he's grappling with. He and his friends and fellow African students are grappling with. And what's really interesting for me as I was writing this, as I was thinking about this story at that time, I was comparing it with the time that I spent at Oxford as a student, because I set it at about the same time that as we were watching on TV, the whole tenement thing as it was unfolding. So if you could just cast your minds back to that period in time, that's when the story kind of begins. So what's happened here at this stage where I'm going to read, my main character, Dan Chiponda, who is from Zimbabwe, has got himself mixed up with this lovely young lady, as students do. Unfortunately, they've run into some difficulties. She fell pregnant, and she's got in trouble with the campus police that the students describe as the campus Gestapo. So what Dan needs to do now is find a way to release her, find a way to get her out of trouble. I racked my brains trying to figure out where they could have taken her. My heart sinking, I realized that she could be at a police station, detention center, or prison. It dawns on me that there is nothing we can do if the campus Gestapo have taken the matter forward. But my mind refuses to accept this possibility. Wang is our only hope. When we get to the bar, he and his wife are just opening up, dusting tables, checking stock records. There are no other customers. It's good to see customers this early, he declares, rubbing his hands with glee. You'll have the usual? Actually, nothing for now, I inform him in a croaky voice. We've come to ask for some help. He hesitates for an instant, then waves us to a table at the back of the bar. The look in his eyes says he has seen it all, whatever it is, but it hardly reassures me. The throbbing in my temple is beginning to turn into a headache. Diallo offers Wang a cigarette. It's Lai Ying. She's in trouble. Wang looks at me calmly, waiting for me to continue. Perhaps he thinks I want to take another advance on my wages. It must be serious trouble, Eggman, he says, lighting a cigarette. You look terrible. I wouldn't trouble you otherwise. The money helped, Wang, and I thank you. But the situation has changed. Lai Ying has been in hospital recently. The campus authorities came for her this morning, claiming she had an illegal abortion. We don't know where she is now. Are they looking for you too? I nod. But I'm not worried about myself, Wang. We need to find Lai Ying. There's someone we can talk to, he says in a slowly drawn out voice. I cannot say he'll help, but he can ask around. This person, says Diallo, leaning toward Wang. Is there some way we can help him, show our appreciation to speed things up? Wang breaks into a laugh. There's nothing you can do, my friend. We stare at him, puzzled. Why do you say that, says Diallo. He will do this for me. You try. We don't want to make it difficult for you, Wang, I put in quickly. I'll do everything I have to. This is very important. I understand. Oh, the simplicity of love. What a joyful thing. No, do not worry yourselves about my friend. You mean we can't afford it, counters Diallo, smiling to take the edge off. It is complicated, says Wang. Master Kung Fu Tzu taught us there are appropriate times and good days for launching attacks with fire. We study his face intently. His only explanation is a cryptic grin. In spite of Wang's promise to help, I have no patience to wait. Knowing that Diallo would try to discourage me, I excuse myself and ride my flying horse into the direction of the nearest police station, 3 miles north of Chaichang. That's where they take students arrested for causing trouble in campus parties. I approach the building with trepidation. If they know I have something to do with it, with the abortion, they'll lock me up too. It is already dark when I get there, out of breath, cold sweat dripping down my back. As I approach the entrance to the imposing blue building, the wisdom of coming here begins to elude me. I should at least have told Diallo. If anything happens to me now, no one will know where to find me. It is too late now. There's no turning back. I'll leave it there for now, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Ken, for sharing that excerpt. And definitely, for anyone who's keen to read, I'd really encourage you to just go and dig in, especially that part. I somehow held my heart here next to my hands as I was reading through, wanting to find out what would happen. And there's lots of suspense. I must say, I was telling Ken earlier that he held us with suspense till the end, when he finally releases what he had yearned to say, but also does not say it all. So it lets you, as the reader, want to find out what happens next. But right now, I'll head to a few questions which I had prepared to ask Ken, and looking forward to your responses. And I would like to encourage us all, if you have any question, please feel free to post in the chat. Otherwise, you can also raise them up towards during the Q&A session. Well, my first question is around the title of the book and even the book itself. I know you've mentioned that you living in Hong Kong inspired you to write, you to get into writing, but what was the main source of your inspiration, if I could phrase it that way, for writing this book, especially capturing the lives of diaspora, Black diaspora in China and Hong Kong?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I would need to take you back to where my writing actually began prior to the Black Ghosts. I had been writing a novel which was set partly in the UK and partly in Kenya when I was a student here in the UK. And I finished that draft, the very first draft of that manuscript. It was called True Warriors. I finished it when I moved to Hong Kong. And I wanted to write something new. And I felt that I needed to write something that would not sort of portray me as a Kenyan writer, but more of an African writer. So I started to look around, and I realized that there was a Black presence in Hong Kong that I hadn't been aware of. In fact, when I first moved to Hong Kong, I mean, I expected there would be Black people there, because you find Black people everywhere, literally. But I was not aware of their stories. I didn't know what their journeys were. So the very first people that I met were Africans who had actually studied in China and had been students in China at the same time as I was a student in the UK. So we had some very interesting parallel stories, but very different stories. And I started to dig into these stories to find out what their lives were like. And I was amazed to discover the challenges some of them had faced, but also the sense of adventure. And I began to feel that there was something there, that there was a story there that needed to be told, because I had never read anything about Africans in Asia. I was not aware of Africans in diaspora in that part of the world, because growing up in Kenya, you sort of gravitate towards the West. You're thinking about moving to the UK, moving to the US, and so forth, and that's partly explained by our colonial links. So discovering that there was a Black tribe, if you like, in Asia was fascinating for me. But there were also challenges. So in fact, some of the things that inspired the story was my own experiences. And the very first story that I wrote was actually called Random Check. And that came about because every time you went through the customs, immigration in Hong Kong as a Black person, they would stop you. And you begin to think, why are they only stopping me? When you look around, you see it's only Black people who are being stopped. So when you ask politely, why are you stopping only the Black people? They say to you, it is just your imagination. This is a random check. So I thought Random Check would be a great, a story, title for a story. So I wrote a story called Random Check. It was one of my first stories to be published. And then as I started thinking more about these issues and encountering challenges and actually also just coming to treat Hong Kong as my home, I realized that there was a bigger story than just a short story. And that's, how, Black Ghosts as a novel came about.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And while you're talking and chatting about Black Ghost, I remember the Chinese word that you give for that. I don't want to butcher and show how my Chinese has gone down, but probably you could tell us that.
The name Black Ghosts it was explained to me when I moved to Asia that Black people were seen as ghosts, Black ghosts, and the Chinese word for that was Hegui or Hagwei, and it just seemed like an inappropriate word to use in an ironic fashion. It had become kind of denuded of its derogatory connotations, although of course it still remains a derogatory term. So that's where it comes from. So there was this feeling that anyone who is foreign is a ghost. So that is the basis of that of that terminology, and I decided to use it for those particular purposes.
Thanks so much for the deep background on that. My next question is around the key character in the book, Chiponda. And I think you somehow responded to one of my key questions, why Chiponda? And Chiponda is from Zimbabwe. And you mentioned you wanted to be known or write as an African author rather than a Kenyan, to be like particularly Kenyan or something like that. Would this be the reason why you decided to choose on Chiponda, him being from Zimbabwe? Was there a particular intention of creating that specific relationship between Zimbabwe, where you bring towards the end of the book, and also in the beginning was grappling with, the settler, like the white people who are occupying much of the land. And towards the end of the book, there's the land reformation that's going on, and war vets bring about different issues. And you juxtapose this to China's situation, how it changes from the 80s to now. They're really keen on investing in Zimbabwe. Was there any intention on that?
What I really wanted to do was to explore something new. And I thought about basing my story on a number of African countries, which I was familiar with, in particular countries that I had visited. And then I thought to myself, I want an adventure. I want a challenge. I want to, set my story in a country that I have never actually been to. Because that will force me to go away and do a lot of research. So Zimbabwe struck me as an interesting option because I had never been to Zimbabwe. I have still not been to Zimbabwe. And so everything I wrote about Dan Chiponda's life and experience and family is all the culmination of research and imagination. So for me, it was a challenge. I was not thinking that later on I'll bring the story to the present and explore the issues to do with, the taking over of the white farms by force. This came later as the story began to evolve. But I wanted, when I settled on Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe was interesting for me because I remember as a student at the University of Nairobi, me and my friends were very keen on and very fascinated and excited by this country that had just been born, as it were, become independent, and everything looks good, everything looked bright. This country with a great future, but you began to see the cracks, and you started to wonder whether it's going to go down the same sort of dictatorial route as many other African countries. So it was a purely, I suppose, coincidental decision that I made, but it worked very well because, ironically and sadly, as I was writing this story, Zimbabwe started to implode, and that offered me opportunities, the opportunity to explore this whole historical narrative. And as I was talking to people from Zimbabwe, both black and white in Hong Kong, realizing how much the tensions run deep, and just how difficult this whole situation was, a situation that needed to be treated with the utmost respect and sensitivity. It just seemed like the obvious option. So that's how I then decided to tie the whole story back to Chinese investors going to Africa, and how all of that story unravels. But as you mentioned, there were obviously challenging and interesting issues about the land reforms. And I did not want to paint a huge canvas about the political situation, but I thought it was important to have that as part of my background. And Zimbabwe just seemed right for that.
Thanks for that response. And also thank you, Stephen, for sending in a question. We'll come back to that. But your response leads me to a question which I grappled with as I was reading your work, just seeing how Africa-China relations have morphed and changed since when you were, like the time you've set in your book, that's in the 80s to now. So I remember in an earlier conversation with you, you had mentioned how during the 80s, the Chinese government was funding lots of African students to come into the country, and there was more of like diplomatic relations in there. And I would really be keen to hear your thoughts about the now perceived controversial, and even then perceived controversial Africa-China relations. And if you could particularly touch on something that you bring up in your work, how during that time, foreign students seemed to be much better, to have much more better access to facilities compared to the students from China. Yes, many questions tied within one, but really keen to hear.
Yeah. I think we'd have to go back to the 60s when the very first cohort, if you like, of African students went to China to study, and as part of the sort of Mao's propaganda with creating an engagement with Africans as comrades. So I remember reading a book about that. You know, one of the very first Africans, I think, there's a writer from Ghana who was part of that cohort, and the experiences the Africans went through, very difficult time. In fact, my understanding is that very few of those very first students actually stayed long enough to finish their university education. They left after a year and a half, because life was hard. China was very poor in the 60s. So fast forward to the 70s and 80s, when things started to improve, things started to get better, but still life was hard in China. So although many took advantage of these opportunities, free education and so forth, scholarships by the Chinese, a chance to study, they had to make it very attractive for the African students. So to the extent that, as some of my informants told me, the students were getting very generous grants and stipends, in some cases better than what their professors were being paid, to make it worth their while. Now that started to create a divide, where the local students who felt that they were being discriminated against, and that was in fact the beginning of some of the tensions that we see, and which I capture, because the major turning point in the story is right at the start, where things get so bad between the African students and the local students, that the local students decided to drive these African students out of town. There was the incident that some of my friends told me when I first moved to Hong Kong about the events in Nanjing. There was a university there where students clashed. And that became a major turning point for the story. In fact, it was one of the really fascinating things I heard about the experiences of Black people in Asia, who is part of a very big debate about Africa-China relations. And if you bring that to the present, the relationship has obviously panned out in a very controversial direction, where it seems as though, although China is keen to argue that they don't have a political colonial reason to be in Africa, you begin to see that there is an economic, colonial kind of relationship. But then when you look very closely at what exactly is going on, it is not actually the Chinese who are the enemy. The Chinese take a very practical approach, a very pragmatic approach. They're there to invest, to extract resources, to buy resources, if you like, in order to feed their economy, to create employment for their people. And I think the challenge is for African countries, as I see it. Are they looking after their best interests? Are they always are they transparent in their relationships with Chinese investors? I think there are serious questions about that, and it seems to me as though African countries do not have a clear strategy for a long-term engagement with China. They seem to be driven by or to be pursuing as sort of short-term tactics, which are often driven by or handled by politicians who don't necessarily have the best interests of their countries at heart. And that's where I think we begin to see challenges. I don't know, perhaps we can explore that a little bit further. But this foreign students, the idea that foreign students having a wonderful experience, being provided with funding and all the rest of it, in some ways that prevents us from seeing the reality of the challenges that they faced. And I try to tap into that, going beneath, looking beneath that life, because in fact they were at the bottom of the pecking order, if you like. So the quest for soft power in China goes way back to the 60s, and what we see is a long historical tradition and trajectory, which for me, certainly in the story, culminates in the Chinese expedition. These Chinese businessmen who decide to venture into Zimbabwe to pursue the business interests, working with the local African elites.
Thank you so much, Ken, for that. You just got me thinking about a satirical piece written by the late Binyavanga Wanaina, talking about how actually the elites, the Oxford educated, and those who coming from the elitist institutions are the ones who are engaging in the very corrupt, if I'd say, businesses and deals. Because one thing you point out in your book is, and that's just, I'm just saying it was a satirical piece, and not everybody from the elitist institutions do this, but you bring that point in your book really nicely when you show that it's the likes of Chiponda who actually bring businessmen such as Wang into China, into Zimbabwe to explore. And we get into, when you take us to Zimbabwe through your book, you show us how the lawyer, the key, like a top lawyer in the society, but who's struggling because of the economy of the country, is the one who's coming up with deals with the generals within the country and who are helping sell this land and to other foreigners at the expense of the local people. But one thing you mentioned is about expeditions, and it takes me back to an interesting bit that you brought up in your book about Zheng He. Hopefully I'm saying the name rightly, and his legacy. And really keen for you to just touch on that and probably touch on how, whether it does reflect in China's investments in Africa today.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. Admiral Zheng He is someone that I first came across when I moved to Hong Kong. He wasn't taught to us in history. I always liked to think that the teaching of history in Kenya was very dynamic, was brilliant. When you learn about all those explorers, from Vasco da Gama to Columbus and so forth. But it turns out that Admiral Zheng He actually reached the east coast of Africa in the 15th century, some, 60, 70 years before Vasco da Gama, which for me was fascinating to discover, because it raises questions about what would have happened if those expeditions had continued. There were lots of expeditions that were being carried out for trade. So they would go out there to buy all kinds of things and sometimes bring back animals. The story is told about how they brought back a giraffe from the east coast of Africa to Asia, and obviously that must have caused quite a stir. But the issue is about what would have happened if these expeditions had continued. So my character Wang, he's an entrepreneur. He's an opportunist. He's a man who wants to make a lot of money. He's always been driven by the need to succeed. And very much felt like a caged bird throughout the 60s and 70s when he was growing up and struggling to make a living, because that's not what he wanted to do. He didn't want to struggle, and I wanted to capture that kind of spirit, the entrepreneurial spirit in a communist state, which is held down, just waiting to be released. And when this release happens, Wang pretty much goes mad. He goes wild. He He wants to conquer the world. But the way he's going to venture into Africa is with the help of Africans. So the African intermediaries, so people like Dan and Dan's relatives back in Zimbabwe. But of course, these people are opportunists. The real culprits, the real villains, if you like, the ones who actually end up selling Africa, aren't the likes of Dan and his cousin. They are the elites back there, you know, the political elites, the military elites, the people who were negotiating those deals. And those are the people that I think we need to be careful about, the people who divert resources, who inflate contracts and misallocate resources. Those are the real people who are creating the problems. The likes of General Chuma. So I wanted to capture this idea that there are Chinese sailors, Chinese adventurers, and so forth, who would have wanted to engage with Africa, but for centuries were stopped from doing so. And Wang wants to pick this up. So when Wang and his buddies say, we are going to do Africa, they're serious about going there to do business. They don't care. They're not bothered about whom they're doing business with. And that's in fact what we find. At the political level, China wants to engage with Africa without strings attached. And Africans in turn engage with China because it gives them that freedom to think about almost as though they're acting without the restraints that have been imposed upon them by, you know, the IMF and the multilateral lenders whose loans come with very stringent conditionalities. So it's almost as if you have these two entities that are finally ready to come together after not having engaged for centuries, and for Africa feeling that they've been treated very badly by the West. So Africa approaching China with a certain recklessness that comes through. Certainly, when you look at the political debate about the relations between Africa and China, there seems to be a recklessness there, which is essentially going to have to be dealt with at some point. And at the moment, it looks as though it's about Africa taking on burdens, debt burdens, that future generations will have to pay. And that's sad.
Sad reality. And yeah, thank you for pointing that out, and really keen to hear other people's reflections on that. And I think at this point,
I think you're frozen. Can't hear you, Ruth.
I think we may have lost Ruth to some internet connectivity problems, which she was worried about before, but I think she was perhaps thinking about moving on to the Q&A. So perhaps waiting for her to come back, Ken, you could answer Stephen's question in the chat.
Okay, where are the questions? Okay, let's see. Chat, okay. There's a bunch of them. Is that Stephen's question?
So Stephen's asked, how do feminist readers react to the idea of girls being transported into men's halls of residence?
And TV boxes.
Yeah.
This is actually, thank you very much, Stephen, for that question. Just to put it in context, what happened was in the story was that because there was this clash, and the university came down really hard on students, saying to them that there are limits on how long. Welcome back, Ruth. We've gone to the Q&A. I think we lost you for a moment, so I thought I would answer a couple of the questions here. So the university decided they're going to put limits on how much time girls can spend in the men's halls of residence. So I remember my friends saying to me that they had to come up with very creative ways to get girls back to the halls. And in fact, on one occasion, my buddy, I don't know if they're here, actually smuggled a girl in a TV box. I thought it was bizarre. I couldn't see how that would have worked, but they did. How do women react to that? I don't know. I think we'll have to ask our female readers. I'm painting the reality here. And yeah, I know it's provocative, but I would be interested to know what people think. but I wanted to tell an honest story about some of the things that students get up to. As a student, Stephen, I don't know, you probably didn't smuggle girls in Fox TV boxes, but students get up to all kinds of interesting adventures. Right, are there any other questions? Let's see. Yeah, we can open it up to other questions.
Yeah, sorry you lost me for a while.
Yeah.
But if I could go in and reflect as one of the female reader who was looking at this, I found that humorous. But perhaps other sections of the book where I questioned were particularly when you're talking about Wang's wife and the fact that she was traumatized after the birth of their first child, and they were ideally living as housemates, and that she had no qualms about Wang bringing in other girls that he picked from the club.
Yeah.
I thought, I was really curious. I was like, is that what Wang's wife really feels? And also, I questioned also a lot about the relation that Wang had with Wang, and also the men in the book had the women they pick in the club. It felt like they were mainly for entertainment or something like that.
Yeah. I think I spent a lot of time in China, as well as other Chinese countries like Taiwan and Singapore, and meeting with business people. The nature of my work often leads me to meet with business people, and you discover very interesting things that go on in the world of business. The situation that I capture here, and I must say also that there are many little stories like those about things that strike you as pretty bizarre. Many of them are actually based on real facts and things that happened. I remember, I think it was in Taiwan, where this businessman friend introduced me to various people. We'd go out to clubs. It is the tradition of working really hard during the day and playing hard. I think that's something that students at Oxford will recognize. So they would go out and drink, put away huge copious amounts of alcohol. But I also noticed that the guys had no qualms about bringing women back. And on one occasion, one guy actually took a girl back together with his wife. I thought that was bizarre. I couldn't quite get my head around that. So I asked my friend, "What's the story here?" He says, sometimes people get to an understanding. What makes the wife happy? It's the opportunity to meet with her friends, to go shopping, spend a month's money. That's his words, not mine. And as long as the man behaves himself, so they have a sort of understanding. That's what I wanted to capture. At the end of the day, this is for them. This is what love means. This is what being in a relationship means. And it's up to readers to make of it what they will. But for me, the challenge is to paint it, to tell the story in such a way that it is actually believable. It seems to make sense from their point of view, but also to interrogate the whole idea of the relationship between men and women, and the extent to which, of course, the situation has changed a lot today. I would imagine we're talking about the 80s and 90s, but women playing a very secondary role. That's not unusual. It's not unusual. It wasn't an issue in the Chinese culture. And it was important for me to look at this, to capture these, and build it as part of the story, which also highlights the extent to which the patriarchal and the very masculine, macho conception of what it means to be a man and a businessman in a society where you're waiting for the opportunity, if you like, to be released. It can take you to very bizarre extremes. So as a writer, I just use my creativity. This is I take a story from something that I've seen, and I turn it into something that perhaps people might find interesting to read.
Well, I find that impressive, and I have lots of questions as an aspiring writer, but I'm going to hand over this moment to anyone who might have a question. Okay. Feel free to unmute or raise your hand or type in the chat. Yes, anyone?
While we're waiting for questions, well, there's something else, Ruth, that you found strange, interesting, that perhaps we can talk about. I mean, I should say one other thing. The whole process of writing was for me a process of discovery. So I was writing about Zimbabwe, about a place I had never been to. China was a place I was writing about because I visited China quite often. Hong Kong, I was writing about because I was living there. So for me, writing about Hong Kong, the middle sections of the book were the ones I enjoyed most, because I would be talking to people, say, we're having a drink, and people are talking about this whole thing with Zimbabwe. They talk about the past experiences, or we talk about our experience of racism and alienation. And those ideas would be, taking over in my mind when I go back home, and they were fresh, and I would write about it. It was exciting, and those chapters moved very quickly. Now, I had no idea how the story was going to end, and it just kind of evolved. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the story. If you're passionate about something, you want to put it to paper, but it's taking you in new directions, and you have so many ideas, which of course was challenging for me, because I had a full-time job. I was an academic, teaching management, human resource management. So you only have a few hours in the day to write. And that's late in the night, very early in the morning. Sometimes I wake up at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the morning and do some writing before going to work, or weekends. And that was never really easy, because when you're raising a family, you got to take kids to all kinds of places, and then find the time to write. But for me, writing was always something that I needed to do. So if you had to ask me, why do I write? What inspires me to write? I mean, I could say to you that like every boy, I've gone through the whole sort of catalog of dreams and aspirations, wanting to be a soldier, a pilot, a sailor, a footballer, all kinds of things. But in some ways, I think for me, there was always the desire to write. It was almost like, the North Star. That's what it is. Writing becomes something that I do because this is who I am. And if I don't write, then I don't exist in a way. So writing because you have to, even though I'm doing all of these other things. And in fact, what I do is write, literally, whether I'm writing academic journal articles on management, or newspaper columns, or fiction, short stories. The years when I was in Hong Kong, I was also writing a weekly column for a Kenyan newspaper. It used to be called Letter from the East. And it was really very much about explaining to people in East Africa what was going on in the East, in Asia. So I would take a story and run with it, offering my opinions, interpreting Asia. And I was getting very interesting feedback from people. I remember a pastor writing to me from Uganda and saying, one of the very first things I do every Sunday is buy the paper and read your article. It was very humbling to me. I mean, it just kind of makes you feel, whatever it is you're writing, if it touches somebody, if it makes somebody think, or maybe even if it annoys somebody, then your job as a writer is done. And that's kind of how it is for me with writing. To entertain, to enlighten, to provoke, to annoy. Well, at least just to get a debate going. So I'm hoping that with the writing of this book, we're going to start having a really fruitful debate about the lives and experiences of the African diaspora in Asia, but also about the Africa-China engagement, and where is Africa going now? What are Africa's choices moving forward? Yeah, I thought I would fill that space while I'm waiting for a question.
And thank you so much for that. And we got 2 questions in the process. Yeah. I think we probably could start with, we could start with Morategi's that has just come in. Have conversations about race and racism changed or progressed between your time in Hong Kong and now, in light of the recent global conversations about and protests against racism in Hong Kong and China?
Right, that's a very good question. I think the first point to make is that xenophobia is rife in Asia, but it's not always in your face. It's not always overt. but sometimes it just takes one thing to trigger a reaction. I was always treated very well in Asia. I didn't really have any serious worries, any serious concerns, nothing I couldn't handle. But of course, there is that simmering kind of alienation, the idea that you don't belong. So there are certain pockets of xenophobia and racism. But I think what happens is in the majority of cases, people coexist. There are Africans living very happily in Asia, in various parts of Asia, coping with often serious challenges, but coping and taking one day at a time. But sometimes what happens is that you might imagine that things are fine, everything is okay, we're coexisting, and that we want the Africans here. A few years ago, on one of my last visits to Asia, and to China specifically before COVID, I remember talking to people in Guangzhou, and they were saying to me, we're visiting a part of Guangzhou where there are lots of Africans. It's actually called Africa City or Africa Town or something like that, or Little Africa, I think. And I happened to ask somebody, what do you make of the Africans here? What's the situation? And they say to me, I suppose in jest, it's okay, we want Africans here, because with Africans, this is the only way China is ever going to win anything in the World Cup. Which is a way of suggesting that, we want them, right? We'll accept them because we know they have something to offer, footballing skills. I mean, I would say it as a joke, but it kind of shows you that you are accepted to the extent that you have value. But when you have something like COVID, then you see Africans being blamed, because it's in the very same city, in Guangzhou, 2020, you remember, the very first wave of the pandemic, Africans were being blamed, being thrown out of their homes. So we then start to wonder, so where is this acceptability? Where is this tolerance? It's been okay so far, and then something happens, and that's it. Africans are to blame. So you can never really be very safe. I mean, the West has often been a target, being blamed for all sorts of things in China. But when the West is not a target, then the most obvious target after that, and sadly, is Black people, or people who are of a darker complexion. Because although we're talking about Black people here, if you look at Asians from say the Southeast, of a darker complexion, they don't always fare that well either. So I don't think the situation has necessarily got any better. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks for that reflection. If we could proceed to the next question, still looking at like the feminist perspective. Anastasia asks, still on the feminist and patriarchal conversation, I'm curious about the experiences of African men and women at the time in China. I'm wondering if the genders were reversed so that the main character was an African woman, how different would the experience have been? This is to understand the experience of Black women diaspora in China at the time of the book's setting.
Okay, thank you very much, Anastasia. I think what I would say is that the movement, if you like, of Africans to China, certainly in the time in question, was almost entirely male. I searched and I asked around and I tried to find out whether, there were Black women studying in China at that time and who they were. And very few people could remember. I mean, they might remember there were some, but no one knew very much about the stories, because for some reason, there were very few to start with. I don't know why that is the case. Perhaps men were much more adventurous in heading out to a different environment, and perhaps the women would have felt safer, if you like, going to the West. But I think women were very absent and very silent. I don't know what the situation would have been. Of course, those who were there, experience the same xenophobia, the same challenges, perhaps even more so than the men. Of course, now, subsequent to that period, there have been more women going to China, more Black women going to China. and faring quite well. I mean, I'm aware of women entrepreneurs, female entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs in China who are running businesses and doing well, and having had to struggle to get acceptance. I'm aware of a community, an association of Africans in China, and a good number of them, majority of them are actually women. So I think it'll be interesting to go back now then and look at what are their stories. I don't know what they are, but that clearly is an interesting line of inquiry.
Thanks for that. I found myself also thinking that I would really be keen to just explore what their stories are and what their experiences are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that takes us probably to the one of the final questions that we'll have today. And I thought you really crafted your book nicely by placing at the center the relationship between Dan and Lai Ying. Yeah, and but at some point, and Stephen has actually pointed out to this, I was personally disappointed when Dan gets into gambling and he's not introduced, like he does this in the company of Tiffany, who Dan's wife had constantly questioned the relationship and their working relationship.
Yeah.
And that finally when Dan's wife escapes to, was it
she goes to Shanghai.
Shanghai, yeah. When she runs off to Shanghai, he finally has a relationship with Tiffany. Do you mind telling us more about that?
Oh, what can I say? It's a story, Ruth. It's a story. I think one of the things I wanted to say about Dan was he had this weight of expectations. He had this pressure he had been living under all these years. Since the experience with the African fish eagle. He always wanted to prove himself. He always wanted to do something, and he was inspired by Kabinga. Kabinga was the businessman par excellence right from the start, and there was always this pressure. He needed to do something. He just chose the wrong moment, and it's not because of anything in particular. I just wanted to identify a specific problem. Flow, this human nature. We all want to do something, right. We want to achieve. We work very hard to achieve, but sometimes we make the wrong choices. And the question is, what are the triggers for those choices, and how do we resolve them? And it seemed to me as though this would be getting him to get into trouble, that kind of trouble. Especially in a place like Hong Kong, which is all about making money. For many people, it's about making money. So he gets sucked into that. And there are lots of people who actually, travel across the water from Hong Kong to Macau to gamble. It's very common. Hong Kong is a very sort of gambling society. It's very much on gambling, whether it's on horse racing in Hong Kong, or going to the casinos. So putting my character in that situation, I wanted to put him in trouble and see how he handled it. And you read the story, you see how he handled it. And of course, it's a problem for him, but as well as for him and his wife and his daughter, because then they're taken away. His daughter is taken away from him, and that hits him hard. And I wanted to put him through that pressure because you can do that as a writer. You put obstacles in the way of your characters and see how they handle it, because that's where the drama is. That's where the tension is. And the test of his character is how he comes through, how he handles it. So that's really how what I wanted him to do. And of course, she wants to go to Africa. She knows she's African. But her mom tells her, no, this is too dangerous a place to go. Right? And obviously that puts this burden on her as well, on all of them. So I hope that I created sufficient tension there to get people, to inspire people to read, and also perhaps to go and write. Because where I stopped is where someone else picks up. The idea about the role of women, African women, in Asia. I think that's a really fascinating story. Maybe that'll be the next book. Who knows?
Well, I think we've ended on such a high note that you write also to inspire others to pick up and continue with the conversation. Mine is to say a massive thank you for this session. Thanks to everyone who's joined us today, and thank you to Ken for sharing with us your time and your knowledge. I have been immensely informed by reading this book, and I had to take a while to just pause and take it in after finishing, and I'd highly recommend the book to everyone else. Thank you so much. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Georgie, who's going to close it off.
Before you do, thank you so much, Ruth. It's been a fascinating conversation. It's given me a lot of ideas, actually, possibly about future work and so forth, but also reflecting on who are these people, who are these characters, and what might their lives look like today. And thank you, Georgie, so much for organizing this session, and to everybody, Stephen, Anastasia, and everybody else in the session. I hope you enjoyed reading the book, and please, don't forget to put in some comments, your comments. I would
Thanks,
appreciate.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken and Ruth. All that I've got left to say is that I hope to see some of you at our next event, and same time next month on April the 20th, and that's with Shanti Gamparajadran, and we'll be talking about her book, America's Energy Gamble, People, Economy and Planet. So drop us an email if you'd like the link to attend that, and thank you all so much for coming. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.